The shot that changed the world. June 28th, 1914. It was supposed to be an ordinary summer morning in the city of Sarajevo. People filled the streets. Shops were open. Children played nearby. No one knew that within a few hours, a single gunshot would push the world into one of the deadliest wars in human history. A man named Archduke Franz Ferdinand was visiting the city that day. He was the heir to the powerful Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many people saw him as the future ruler of one of Europe's largest empires. But not everyone welcomed his arrival. At that time, Europe looked peaceful on the surface. Yet underneath, tensions were growing everywhere. Nations competed for power. Empires fought over territory. Old rivalries burned hotter every year. And nowhere was the situation more dangerous than in the Balkans. The Balkans were often called the powder keg of Europe. Different ethnic groups lived side by side. Many wanted independence. Many wanted more land. Many dreamed of creating their own nations. One of those nations was Serbia. Serbia had recently won several wars. Its confidence was growing. Its leaders dreamed of uniting all South Slavic people into one powerful state. But there was a problem. Millions of South Slavs lived inside Austria-Hungary, especially in Bosnia. As long as Austria-Hungary controlled Bosnia, Serbia's dream could never become reality. This angered many young nationalists. Among them was a secret group that believed violence was the answer. They decided that one man stood in the way of their future, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and so they planned his assassination. On the morning of June 28th, several assassins spread themselves across Sarajevo. Each waited for the Archduke's motorcade to pass. The plan was simple: kill the Archduke, change history. As the motorcade moved through the city, one assassin lost his nerve. Another missed his chance. Then a third attacker threw a bomb. The explosive bounced off the Archduke's car. Moments later it exploded under a different vehicle. Several people were injured, but the Archduke survived. The assassination appeared to have failed. The attackers were frustrated. The authorities were confused, and most people believed the danger had passed. But fate had other plans. Instead of leaving the city, Franz Ferdinand decided to visit those wounded in the bombing. His driver began heading toward the hospital. Then something unbelievable happened. The driver took a wrong turn. At almost the exact same moment, one of the assassins was standing nearby. His name was Gavrilo Princip. Only minutes earlier, he believed the mission had failed. Now, suddenly, his target appeared right in front of him. The car stopped. The Archduke was only a few feet away. Princip pulled out his pistol. He fired. 2 shots echoed through the street. One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand. The other hit his wife Sophie. Within minutes, both were dying. The assassination was complete. The young assassin had no idea what he had just unleashed, because these 2 gunshots would not only kill an archduke, they would trigger a chain reaction across Europe. Within weeks, alliances would activate. Empires would mobilize. Millions of soldiers would march to war. And a conflict unlike anything the world had ever seen would begin. The First World War. But before the first trenches were dug, before the first massive battles were fought, Europe's leaders still had one final chance to stop the coming disaster. Instead, they made everything worse. Europe walks into war. The assassination was over. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was dead. His killer had been arrested. And for a brief moment, it seemed possible that the crisis would end there. But Europe in 1914 was not a calm place. It was a continent filled with rivalries, fear, and military alliances. One spark had already landed. Now the powder keg was about to explode. Austria-Hungary was furious. Its leaders did not see the assassination as the act of a single gunman. They believed Serbia was behind it. Whether that was completely true or not no longer mattered. Austria wanted revenge. But before taking action, they turned to their most powerful ally, Germany. The German leadership promised full support, no matter what happened. Historians later called this promise the blank check. It was essentially Germany telling Austria, Do whatever you need to do. We will stand with you. With Germany's backing secured, Austria-Hungary prepared its response. On July 23, 1914, Serbia received an ultimatum. The demands were harsh, very harsh. Austria wanted Serbia to accept conditions that would allow Austrian officials to operate inside Serbian territory. For an independent nation, this was almost impossible to accept. Yet Serbia surprised everyone. They agreed to most of the demands. In fact, they accepted nearly all of them. But Austria wasn't looking for compromise anymore. They were looking for a reason to go to war. On July 28, Austria-Hungary officially declared war on Serbia. The first domino had fallen. Artillery shells soon began striking the Serbian capital of Belgrade. The local conflict had begun. But Europe had a much bigger problem: the alliance system. For decades, countries had signed military agreements designed to protect themselves. Now those agreements were pulling nation after nation into the crisis. Russia immediately paid attention. Russia saw itself as the protector of Slavic nations. And Serbia was a fellow Slavic country. Allowing Austria to crush Serbia would be a major defeat for Russian influence. So the Russian government made a decision. They began mobilizing their army. At first, the move was meant as a warning, a show of strength. But in 1914, mobilization was almost the same as declaring war. Millions of men began preparing for military service. Railroads started moving troops. Weapons were distributed. The giant Russian war machine slowly came to life. Germany watched with growing alarm. German military leaders believed they could not afford to wait. Their entire war strategy depended on speed. If Russia fully mobilized, Germany would soon face a nightmare scenario: war in the east against Russia, and war in the west against France. A two-front war, exactly what Germany feared most. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. The crisis was now becoming a continental conflict. But Germany had another concern: France. Russia and France were allies. German planners knew France would eventually join the war. And they already had a plan ready. A plan that had been sitting in military offices for years. The Schlieffen Plan. The idea seemed simple. Germany would defeat France first, then turn east and defeat Russia later. The plan depended on one critical assumption: Russia would mobilize slowly. That would give Germany enough time to knock France out of the war. But there was one problem. France's border defenses were strong. A direct attack would be costly. So German planners chose another route. They would go around the defenses, through Belgium. There was only one issue. Belgium was neutral. International agreements guaranteed its neutrality. Germany asked for passage. Belgium refused. Germany invaded anyway. On August 4th, German troops crossed the Belgian border. The invasion shocked Europe, and it created another enemy: Britain. The British government had guaranteed Belgian neutrality. Now Germany had violated it. The decision was made. Britain declared war on Germany. In only a few weeks, a local Balkan crisis had transformed into a European war. Austria-Hungary, Serbia, Russia, Germany, France, Britain. One after another, they entered the conflict. Millions of soldiers began marching. Train stations filled with cheering crowds. Many believed the war would be over by Christmas. Young men rushed to enlist. Families waved goodbye. Politicians promised quick victories. Almost nobody understood what was coming, because modern industrial warfare had never been tested on this scale before. Machine guns, heavy artillery, barbed wire, mass mobilization. Europe was about to discover what happened when 19th century ideas met 20th century weapons. And the result would be catastrophic. As German armies pushed through Belgium, they moved closer and closer to Paris. For a moment, it seemed the Schlieffen Plan might actually work. France stood in danger. The fate of the entire war hung in the balance. And then, everything changed. The miracle on the Marne. By August 1914, Europe was fully at war. Millions of soldiers were moving across the continent. Railroads worked day and night. Governments called up reserves. Factories switched to wartime production. And at the center of it all stood Germany. Their strategy was clear. Defeat France first. Defeat Russia later. The Schlieffen Plan was now in motion. German armies stormed through Belgium with incredible speed. Towns fell one after another. Fortresses that were expected to hold for weeks collapsed within days. The advance shocked Europe. Many military observers believed France was finished. The German army kept moving west, then south, closer and closer to Paris. For the people of France, fear spread rapidly. Refugees crowded roads. Families fled their homes. Entire villages emptied as the sound of artillery moved closer. Meanwhile, French commanders desperately searched for a way to stop the German advance. Every day mattered. Every mile mattered. If Paris fell, the war could be over before the year ended. By early September, German troops were only a short distance from the French capital. Many believed victory was within their grasp. But there was a problem. The German advance had been almost too successful. Their supply lines stretched farther and farther behind them. Soldiers were exhausted. Food and ammunition struggled to keep pace. Communication became increasingly difficult. The deeper they moved into France, the more vulnerable they became. French commanders noticed the opportunity. They prepared a massive counterattack. And on September 6, 1914, one of the most important battles in modern history began. The Battle of the Marne. French and British forces launched attacks against the advancing Germans. The fighting was fierce. Entire units disappeared under artillery fire. Machine guns tore through charging infantry. Thousands died within hours. But despite the terrible losses, the Allies kept pushing. Then German commanders discovered a dangerous gap in their lines. If the Allies broke through, their entire army could be surrounded. The risk was too great. Reluctantly, the Germans ordered a retreat. For the first time since the war began, Germany's unstoppable advance had been halted. Paris was saved. France survived. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. And with its failure, the war changed forever. The Germans fell back to defensive positions along the Aisne River. There, they began digging. At first, the trenches were simple. Just shallow defensive positions. Temporary shelters. Nothing more. But then something unexpected happened. The Allies attacked. The Germans defended. Neither side could break through. Both suffered enormous casualties. And so they dug deeper. Then deeper still. Soon, both sides began trying to outflank each other. Each army raced northward, hoping to get around the enemy's defenses. The maneuver became known as the race to the sea. But every time one side moved, the other followed. And every time they stopped, they dug more trenches. Week after week, the trench line grew longer. Eventually, it stretched from the North Sea all the way to the Swiss border. Hundreds of miles of trenches. A giant scar cutting across Europe. The war of movement was over. The war of trenches had begun. Life inside those trenches was miserable. Mud swallowed boots. Rats crawled everywhere. Diseases spread quickly. Rain turned the ground into a swamp. Soldiers often stood in cold water for days. Many developed a painful condition known as trench foot. Some lost toes. Some lost entire feet. And all of them lived under the constant threat of death. Day and night, artillery shells exploded overhead. Snipers watched every movement. Machine guns waited for anyone foolish enough to expose themselves. Between the two trench systems lay a deadly zone. A barren wasteland of mud, shell craters, barbed wire, and corpses. The soldiers called it no man's land. Crossing it was often a death sentence. Yet commanders on both sides continued searching for a breakthrough. Again and again, thousands of young men were ordered to leave the safety of their trenches and charge toward enemy positions. Again and again, machine guns cut them down. Sometimes entire attacks gained only a few hundred yards. Sometimes they gained nothing at all. And still the killing continued. By the end of 1914, millions had already been killed, wounded, or captured. The quick war everyone expected had vanished. Instead, Europe found itself trapped in a nightmare. A war with no end in sight. A war where entire generations would be sacrificed for a few miles of ground. And as terrible as the trenches already were, even deadlier weapons were about to arrive. Poison gas, tanks, submarines, and battles so bloody that the world would never forget their names. Verdun, the Somme. The worst was still ahead. The killing fields of Europe. By 1915, the war had become something nobody expected. The fast-moving offensives of 1914 were gone. Instead, millions of soldiers sat trapped inside trenches stretching across Western Europe. The front lines barely moved. Yet every single day, men continued to die. Generals on both sides faced the same problem. How do you break through enemy trenches protected by machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire? No one had the answer, so they kept trying, and each attempt produced more bloodshed. Life in the trenches was a nightmare. When it rained, trenches filled with mud. Some soldiers sank knee-deep into it. Others slept surrounded by water. Rats became permanent residents. They fed on scraps of food. Sometimes they fed on the dead. Many grew as large as cats. Lice infested uniforms and blankets. Disease spread rapidly. Every soldier lived under constant stress. At any moment, a sniper bullet or artillery shell could end their life. Sleep was rare. Fear was constant. But conditions were about to get even worse. Because in April 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres, the Germans introduced a terrifying new weapon: poison gas. Thousands of gas cylinders had been hidden along the German lines. When the wind blew in the right direction, soldiers opened the valves. A green cloud slowly drifted toward Allied trenches. At first, many soldiers didn't understand what they were seeing. Then the gas arrived. Men began coughing violently. Others struggled to breathe. Eyes burned. Lungs filled with fluid. Panic spread through the trenches. Thousands fled. Many never escaped. The gas attack created a massive gap in the Allied lines. For the first time, an entirely new form of warfare had appeared. Soon both sides began developing their own chemical weapons. Chlorine gas, phosgene gas, mustard gas, each deadlier than the last. Soldiers carried gas masks everywhere. Even then, protection wasn't guaranteed. A damaged mask could mean a horrible death. The battlefield had become a laboratory of destruction. Yet despite all these new weapons, the front still refused to break. So commanders planned even larger offensives. Then came 1916, a year remembered for two of the bloodiest battles in human history. The first was Verdun. The German plan was simple. They would attack a place the French could never abandon. Then they would force France to defend it at any cost. The goal was not merely to capture territory. The goal was to bleed France dry. Verdun became a slaughterhouse. For 10 months, shells rained down almost without pause. Entire forests disappeared. Villages were erased from the map. The ground itself was torn apart. French soldiers rotated through the battlefield in endless waves. Many never returned. The fighting became so intense that some units lost most of their men within days. Yet the French refused to surrender. Their famous rallying cry echoed throughout the country: "They shall not pass." And they didn't. Verdun held, but at a terrible cost. Hundreds of thousands of casualties littered the battlefield. Neither side achieved a decisive victory, only more suffering. While Verdun raged, another giant battle was preparing further north. The Battle of the Somme. The British hoped this offensive would finally break the German lines and relieve pressure on Verdun. Months of planning went into the attack. Massive stockpiles of artillery shells were gathered. Commanders believed the bombardment would destroy German defenses completely. 4 days, Allied guns fired millions of shells. The earth shook continuously. Many officers became convinced that no German soldier could possibly survive. They were wrong. On July 1st, 1916, British troops climbed out of their trenches and advanced. What happened next shocked the world. German machine guns survived. As the soldiers crossed no man's land, machine gun fire ripped through their ranks. Entire units vanished within minutes. By the end of the first day, the British Army had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, the worst single day in its history. And yet the battle continued. Week after week, month after month, the Somme became another symbol of industrial-scale killing. But amid the horror, a new machine appeared, one that promised to change warfare forever: the tank. In September 1916, the British deployed the first tanks in combat. They looked strange, large steel boxes crawling across the battlefield. Slow, loud, unreliable. Many broke down before reaching the enemy. Others became stuck in mud. But those that worked achieved something remarkable. They crossed trenches. They crushed barbed wire. They protected soldiers from machine gun fire. German troops were stunned. Some had never seen anything like them before. The tank was far from perfect, yet it offered a glimpse of the future. A future where mobility might return to the battlefield. A future where trenches could finally be overcome. Still, that future remained distant. Because in 1916, despite poison gas, massive offensives, and the first tanks, the war remained locked in place. Millions had already died. Millions more would follow. And beyond the trenches of France, events were unfolding that would change the entire balance of the war. In the east, the Russian Empire was beginning to crack. Food shortages were spreading. Anger was growing. And soon, an entire empire would collapse. The fall of empires. By 1917, the war had been raging for nearly 3 years. Millions were dead. Millions more were wounded. And across Europe, people were beginning to ask a dangerous question. Was the war even worth it anymore? No country felt this pressure more than Russia. Since the beginning of the conflict, Russian soldiers had fought some of the largest battles of the war. They had faced Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Again and again, they were sent into battle. Again and again, they suffered enormous losses. Entire armies were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands were captured. Millions were killed or wounded. The Russian people were exhausted. Food became scarce. Prices soared. Factories struggled to keep up with demand. Railways failed to deliver supplies efficiently. Even the army itself often lacked basic equipment. Some soldiers reached the front without rifles. They were told to wait until another soldier died and then take his weapon. As conditions worsened, public anger exploded. Many blamed Tsar Nicholas II, the man who ruled the Russian Empire. To ordinary citizens, he appeared completely disconnected from reality. While soldiers died at the front and families struggled to survive, confidence in the government collapsed. Then came the breaking point. In early 1917, protests erupted in Petrograd, the capital city. Workers walked off their jobs. Crowds filled the streets. What began as demonstrations quickly turned into a revolution. The government lost control. Even members of the military refused to suppress the protesters. The Tsar suddenly found himself abandoned. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. After more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule, the Russian monarchy came to an end. It was one of the most dramatic political collapses in modern history. A temporary government took power. Many hoped it would stabilize the country, but it made one critical mistake. It kept Russia in the war. The people wanted peace. Instead, they got more fighting, more casualties, more suffering. Support for the new government rapidly disappeared. And another group saw an opportunity. The Bolsheviks, led by a revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks promised 3 simple things: peace, land, bread. For millions of desperate Russians, that message was impossible to ignore. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power. Another revolution had begun. This time, the government fell almost overnight. Russia was now under communist control. And Lenin intended to keep his promise. Russia would leave the war. For Germany, this seemed like fantastic news. For years, Germany had feared fighting on 2 fronts. Now the Eastern Front was collapsing. German leaders believed victory might finally be within reach. In March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The terms were harsh. Russia surrendered enormous territories. Millions of people suddenly found themselves outside Russian control. Germany gained access to valuable resources and land. For a brief moment, it looked like Germany had won the East. But while one enemy was leaving the war, another was entering. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States had been watching the conflict carefully. At first, America remained neutral. Most Americans wanted nothing to do with Europe's war. But neutrality became harder to maintain. German submarines were sinking ships throughout the Atlantic. Some carried American passengers. Others carried American goods. Tensions increased with every attack. Then came the famous Zimmermann telegram. German officials secretly proposed an alliance with Mexico. If America entered the war against Germany, Mexico would join the Central Powers. In return, Germany promised support for recovering lost territories in the American Southwest. The message was intercepted and exposed. Public outrage exploded. The United States had heard enough. On April 6, 1917, America declared war on Germany. At first, the impact seemed limited. Building an army takes time. Training soldiers takes time. Transporting them across an ocean takes time. But eventually, hundreds of thousands of fresh American troops began arriving in Europe. Then millions. The balance of power slowly started shifting. Germany understood the danger. If they waited too long, American manpower would become overwhelming. So in 1918, Germany launched one final gamble. A massive offensive on the Western Front. Their goal was simple: defeat Britain and France before America could fully arrive. At first, the attack worked. German troops advanced farther than they had in years. Entire Allied positions collapsed. Panic spread through parts of the front. For a moment, victory seemed possible. But Germany had one major problem. Its soldiers were exhausted. Its economy was breaking down. Food shortages were becoming severe. The country was running out of strength. And now fresh American troops were appearing everywhere. The offensive gradually lost momentum. Then the Allies counterattacked. And this time, Germany could not stop them. The tide of the war had finally turned. Across Europe, Germany's allies began falling apart. Bulgaria surrendered. The Ottoman Empire surrendered. Austria-Hungary started collapsing from within. National groups demanded independence. The empire fractured into pieces. Germany suddenly found itself standing alone. And the final chapter of the war was approaching. A chapter that would reshape the entire world. The end of the Great War. By the summer of 1918, Germany was running out of time. For 4 long years, the German Empire had fought some of the most powerful nations on earth. Its soldiers had marched through Belgium, battled France, fought Russia, faced Britain, and now, America. Despite years of fighting, Germany had failed to achieve a decisive victory. The war that was supposed to last a few months had become a nightmare that seemed endless. Food was disappearing. Factories struggled to keep up. Fuel was scarce. The British naval blockade continued choking the German economy. Back home, civilians stood in long lines for basic supplies. Many families survived on limited rations. Children suffered from malnutrition. Meanwhile, at the front, German soldiers faced a new reality. Every week brought more American troops. Every month brought more American equipment. Every day made Germany's position weaker. The final German offensive of 1918 had failed. Now the Allies were advancing. And they were advancing everywhere. The Allied counteroffensive became known as the 100 Days Offensive. British forces pushed forward. French forces pushed forward. American forces pushed forward. German defenses that had held for years began collapsing. The war was no longer a stalemate. For the first time since 1914, Germany was being driven backward. One position after another fell. One defensive line after another broke. German commanders understood the truth. The war could no longer be won. Then things became even worse. Germany's allies were disappearing. In September 1918, Bulgaria surrendered. Soon afterward, the Ottoman Empire followed. Austria-Hungary was also falling apart. National groups inside the empire demanded independence. Czechs wanted their own state. Slovaks wanted their own state. Croats wanted their own future. The empire that had helped start the war was now collapsing from within. By October, Austria-Hungary was effectively finished. Germany suddenly found itself standing alone. And at home, the situation was becoming explosive. Workers were angry. Families were hungry. Soldiers were exhausted. Many Germans no longer believed victory was possible. Then the Navy received orders for one final major operation. The plan was risky, perhaps even suicidal. Many sailors refused. Mutinies spread through the fleet. The unrest quickly spread to cities across Germany. Soon, protests and revolutionary movements appeared throughout the country. The German government was losing control. The empire itself was beginning to crumble. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. The man who had ruled Germany throughout the war stepped down and fled into exile. The German Empire was over. A new government immediately sought peace. 2 days later, on the morning of November 11, 1918, representatives met inside a railway carriage in France. There, Germany agreed to an armistice. The guns would finally fall silent. At exactly 11 a.m., the fighting stopped. After more than 4 years of war, the First World War was over. Across Europe, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang. Crowds filled the streets. People embraced complete strangers. For millions, it felt like the nightmare had finally ended. But beneath the celebrations lay a devastating reality. Entire regions had been destroyed. Cities were damaged. Economies were shattered. Families mourned fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands who would never return. The human cost was staggering. Around 40 million people had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. An entire generation had been scarred forever. Yet the peace that followed would prove almost as important as the war itself. In 1919, world leaders gathered near Paris. Their goal was to create a lasting peace. The most important meeting took place at the Palace of Versailles. There, the victorious powers began writing the future of Europe. The treaty they produced would change the continent forever. Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the war. It lost territory. It lost colonies. Its military was heavily restricted, and it was ordered to pay enormous reparations. Many Germans felt humiliated. Many believed the treaty was unfair. Resentment began growing. Anger began spreading. At the time, some leaders warned that the treaty might create new problems instead of solving old ones. One famous observer reportedly remarked that the agreement was not a true peace. It was merely a pause, a 20-year armistice. History would soon prove those fears correct, because while World War I had ended, the conditions for an even larger conflict were already taking shape. Across Germany, economic hardship deepened. Political extremism grew. New movements emerged, and among them was one led by a former soldier who believed Germany had been betrayed. His name was Adolf Hitler. The world did not know it yet, but the end of one war had quietly planted the seeds of another. A war even more destructive. A war that would engulf the entire planet. A war known as World War II.